This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez, again with Adam Knott. So we've been taking turns talking about each other's writings and each other's ideas. Last episode, I really enjoyed our discussion about a couple of articles that I've written. And the episode before that, we delved into Adam's essay, The Logic of Liberty. And we did kind of a bird's eye view in that episode. And so in this episode, we're going to sort of take a magnifying lens to a certain particular aspect of his ideas and his argument in that essay. And so, Adam, you are going to read something new you wrote. Is that right?
Yes, Dan. I just wanted to elaborate on some ideas that were in my essay and try to demonstrate, in a sense, how they're quite normal, even though at first when you hear them, it's a little shocking or a little taboo. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish today.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I'll start. Before I start, I just wanted to let the viewers know that I am going to read from some prepared notes that I made because I didn't want to miss any of my primary points. And then also before I begin, just to let people know that I'm going to use the word restrictions a lot in what we're talking about. And there's nothing, it's not some special term that you need to know about, but restrictions just means in the legal context that either you're restricted, you're not allowed to do something, or you're told you have to do something. A restriction just means you're being told essentially by government that you can't do what you wanted to do or do what the way you wanted to do. And so when I use the term restriction, it's just a shorthand for government guidelines that are backed up by legislation and penalties if you don't comply. If I use the term waiver, it just means an exemption from a restriction or an exemption from a regulation. So these terms, nobody has to grapple with trying to say, what does he mean there? It's just very basic that when we walk out into the world, there are things that we're prohibited from doing, or on the other hand, there are things that we're mandated that we have to do. And I just use various words: restrictions, waivers, regulations, exemptions. They're general terms, so there's no special magic to them. So what we had talked about before was the idea that the existing legal system is structured in such a way that allows some people to engage in activities that other people are prevented from engaging in. We use the example for an example. I'm not allowed to arrest somebody and put handcuffs on them and put them in my car and read them the rights and all this stuff. If I try to do so, I'll end up in front of the legal system and they'll say, well, Adam, you don't have the identification to do that. Only a certain amount of certain people are allowed to do that. Or if I, for example, try to drive my car in a public park and eventually I'll be apprehended. And the idea will be, well, Adam, you don't have the proper identification to be doing that. There are park rangers and they're allowed to do that. So this is something, and I say this not as a complaint, it's just a fact of our legal existence. And the way to understand this is just to basically assume that there's a blanket restriction. So 350 million people in the United States are restricted or prohibited from doing certain things, but a small percentage of people are allowed an exemption or a waiver from those restrictions. So the park ranger is allowed to drive in the public park, and the policeman's allowed to arrest people, handcuff them, and put them in his patrol car. But the rest of us aren't allowed to. So it's normal in our society that we have laws that everybody has to follow, except for people who get waivers or restrictions. So it's very, very simple idea, and we say that not as a complaint, but just to note that that's how things are working, because it could be helpful for us to know that. This legal structure, which is ubiquitous and largely non-controversial, has important implications for libertarian social theory because it's proof that a particular version of a libertarian society is consistent with contemporary non-libertarian society. This is because the regulations of non-libertarian society are the primary obstacle preventing the emergence of a libertarian society. So an example, see what I'm saying, is that a typical mandate might be in our society would be if you hire someone, you must pay them at least $25 an hour. So that's a mandate. A typical restriction would be if you hire someone, you cannot pay them less than $25 an hour. So basically, we're getting back to a restriction or mandate. It really doesn't matter. Basically, there's what you have. If you go to do this activity, here's what you better do, or else you're going to face some consequences. Absent these regulations, libertarians could enter voluntary agreements as the basis for their social interaction. So if those regulations didn't exist or those restrictions didn't exist, a person could just agree on wage voluntarily. So the regulations are what basically preventing libertarian society because it's preventing these voluntary agreements, basically. If we were allowed to or permitted to, let's say, have voluntary agreements where we are not now, that would be, in a sense, a move towards libertarianism or the beginning of a libertarian society. But we'll get into that a little bit more. So the lesson from there is that if libertarians could obtain a waiver or exemption from some of the existing legal restrictions, that would potentially constitute a nascent libertarian society. This would be a conception in which non-libertarian society authorizes or permits waivers or exemptions to libertarians regarding specific activities. So what I'm saying here is that what we just talked about here, if you applied that to libertarians, a particular libertarian person would have some identification that just like policemen do or park rangers do, and they could present that as proof that they're allowed to engage in the activity that is prohibited for the rest of society. So that's
just to interrupt you with a funny anecdote. There's are you familiar with the show Parks and Rec?
Well, yes, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
And what's the name of the libertarian character? Ron Swanson.
He's the guy with the mustache. I don't know what his name is.
I haven't even seen this scene. I think I've only seen memes of it, and I don't know what he was doing, but maybe like a park ranger or maybe like a police officer, some authority figure went up to him and said, like, do you have a permit for doing like whatever it is he's doing? And so he produces this piece of paper where he just wrote, I can do what I want.
Yeah.
And that was his permit.
That's awesome. So, so he presented, in this case, his documentation that ostensibly allowed him to engage in the activity in question. And so, but the point was that just as a park ranger or policeman are given exemptions from the restrictions or from the exemptions from the regulations, it would be wonderful from a libertarian perspective if we could petition and receive such exemptions, even minor ones, such as we can give other examples like free speech or minimum wage, things that are not huge things like freedom from taxes or from polluting rivers, but start small and then grow from there. But so that's the reason for bringing that feature of the legal system up and for making it explicit. However, we judge that absence a significant change in worldwide political ideology, such exemptions or waivers are unlikely to be granted by non-libertarian society. So a version of libertarian society is feasible. In other words, it could be done in principle, but it's unlikely to be authorized or allowed or permitted by non-libertarian society. So obviously, from what I said, there's nothing that technically prevents society from printing up cards or documentation for libertarians to gain exemptions or waivers, but they just don't want to do that, which we understand. So that leads to the following question. If non-libertarian society is unlikely to grant restrictions or waivers, restriction waivers to libertarians, are there alternative methods to instituting a nascent libertarian society in the sense that we've been talking about, which is getting some sort of waiver from regulations or restrictions? So is there another pathway if we assume that we will never be allowed these waivers or exemptions. Is there some other way to get them? And this is what led me in my writing to the idea that, well, perhaps libertarians could just grant waivers or exemptions to each other. That was an interesting idea as the beginning of a nascent libertarian society. So in this conception, this idea, the relationship between people in non-libertarian society would remain the same. In other words, nothing would change. Only the relationship between libertarians would change. So if we use the example of minimum wage, everybody in society would still be functioning according to the minimum wage. And then also a libertarian, in dealing with a member of non-libertarian society, mainstream society, would probably have to pay that non-libertarian the minimum wage because their government is protecting them with laws and rules and with enforcement. So, but the relationship between libertarians would be the one where there would be no minimum wage. So there's kind of three relationships there: the relationship between mainstream society people, the relationship between libertarians as they are within mainstream society, and then there's the relationship between libertarians, which would be according to voluntary agreement, not according to the regulations. So this is a concept in which the libertarians, just like the guy in Parks and Recreation, granted to each other an exemption between themselves, and then didn't have to petition for permission or petition for authorization from larger society. So these exemptions or waivers from non-libertarian restrictions would be unauthorized and prohibited, not permitted. But if they were enacted by libertarians, they nevertheless would constitute a version of a nascent libertarian society. Obviously, such unauthorized exemptions or waivers are likely to engender anger or hostility on the part of non-libertarian society. So, if we're going to be realistic, of course, if libertarians started doing that, there'd be people that would be unhappy about that, and they might just start to take action to try to prevent it. So that's obvious. Okay. So, if we agree with everything I've just said, if everything I said makes sense and there's no, controversies, or, if we can agree on that, so that means that a nascent libertarian society could potentially be initiated, but it would possibly engender the hostility on the part of non-libertarian society, since the restriction waivers would not be authorized. And this hostility is the primary risk or cost to the initiation of a libertarian society. In other words, we could at any point in time initiate kind of a small libertarian society, but there's a risk to doing so. That is that society at large would be angry and perhaps hostile. So that's the primary risk or cost, is the hostility of society. So go ahead, Dan.
So I had emailed you this question earlier. So today, some people do get paid under the table under minimum wage, and it seems that the person who's agreeing to work under the minimum wage is implicitly granting the employer a waiver from minimum wage laws.
Correct.
Is that what you're talking about, or is it something more formal than that?
Well, that is what I'm talking about, except that I don't envision this as being clandestine or underground. In other words, just as the park ranger and just as the policeman engage in restricted activities, I see this as something where, in the words of classical libertarianism, libertarians would have rights they would gain a right in those terms to engage in the activity either through authorized waivers, permitted waivers, or through unilaterally declared waivers. Either way. As personally, I would be open to either form, But the essential issue is that can libertarians um, start to gain such liberties, and if they can, what's the best way to do that? Um, while we're on the subject, I'd say that one mistake that I think libertarians made was trying to gain those exemptions for all of society, whereas I think it would have been much more effective if they had tried to gain them just for themselves. Because if you think about it, there's 100 people and only 3 or 4 people want a certain relationship, it's much more effective and much more feasible to institute that relationship between 4 people than the all 100 people, because now I have to go try to force those people who are unwilling to have a quote unquote libertarian relationship. So I think that was a strategic mistake on the part of libertarians, um, which probably, in my view, wasted a lot of number of decades. So I'm thinking just in terms of the people who want a certain relationship proceeding to establish that by the means that they deem to be the best means. In other words, what's the path to obtaining that? Is it to petition society for these waivers or exemptions, or is it to unilaterally declare them in some way? And actually that's kind of the interesting part about what I'm going to go through here, because I'm going to show in what I'm talking about how some people in society have already caught on to what we're discussing here, and they're doing it. And I think it'll be a little surprising when you see what they're doing and how they're acting very libertarian in granting themselves exemptions from the restrictions. So, and I'm going to get to that. It's pretty fascinating. And when we see that, we'll see, well, wait, they're doing kind of what we might want to do. So it's kind of neat. They're kind of introducing a principle of political action that I think is kind of promising in a way. So anyways, so the basic structure, what we have is, and what I'm talking about is, it's basically, and you alluded to this as well earlier today, there's 3 groups. So there's the group that are going to, in a sense, unilaterally engage in a activity. One group's going to grant an exemption, the other group's going to do the thing. And there's a third group which is going to be upset about it. They're going to be angry, and they're going to be very hostile. This is going to enrage them. It's going to make them very angry. So there's 3 groups. One person grant or group grants the exemption. One person gets to do the activity, and the third person who didn't approve of this is pretty upset. And then there's the risks on both sides. So for the group that does this unilateral restriction, the risk is, well, what would that third group do? They're going to be mad. What would they do? So that's a major risk. For the third group, the risk is, well, what if I try to stop that? If I don't like what those 2 people are doing, there's a risk if I try to stop it, because they may get mad at me or they may come back my way. So both the two groups that are, in a sense, unilaterally lifting the restriction have risks that the third group is angry and may do something. The third group has a risk in that if they try to stop it. So you'll see kind of what I mean as we go along. So those are the essential. It's very simple, and you'll structure, and you'll see how it works as we go on. Okay. So when we discuss this social process, which I touched on before, where libertarians might just grant each other restriction waivers, let's say for a minimum wage, we intuitively believe that we're talking about something very taboo, because as you said, Dan, typical way of avoiding minimum wages is you go under the table, out of view of the authorities, and you conduct a clandestine, agreement or a clandestine relationship, and that's showing how that you're doing something taboo or something that's not permitted. So you're kind of sneaking around in the shadows. But in what I'm about to outline, I hope to show our viewers how this is not as taboo as you would think, and that may tell us something about how things might go in the future. So the first example that I think is really, really interesting is our recent immigration controversies that we had in the United States, that we went through the last 4.5 years or whatever. And without getting too into the details, the way the three groups were: there's the immigrants who want to come across the border, there's the authorities who are going to grant the waiver or the exemption, and then there's the third group who is very angry about it. So if we look at what happened, so let's say I'm an immigrant, I'm coming up from South America, I'm planning to come across the border, and I say out to the void of the United States, I say, well, I want to come over, but I'm afraid that I might get apprehended when I come across the border. And I'm also afraid that if I get across the border, I'm going to be apprehended and imprisoned and sent back. So I'm not really comfortable with doing this. And the other people on the other side say, don't worry about it, because we're going to waive the restriction. We're going to give you an exemption. We're not going to enforce the restriction. So you're free to come across. So the two groups basically unilaterally, or together, one is the group that wants to do something. One is the group who's going to allow it now, and they're going to waive enforcement of the restriction or the regulation. And of course, the third group is livid. They're really upset with this. So then there's the risks. So what I think is really fascinating, if you look at the immigration issue and you recall how mad the people were who disagreed with it, but you can tell just from a logical point of view that there must have been huge risks with stopping it, because the action proceeded. So in other words, the immigration did occur and was not stopped. The millions of Americans who were upset with it, they didn't drive down to the border, and they didn't go down there with their arms. And there's a very good reason for that, because that would entail gigantic risks. Because if they got down there, they might get in an armed confrontation with the authorities, and so they may get physically harmed. They may again run into the authorities and be imprisoned, lose their jobs. So the activity proceeded because the risks of stopping it from those who wanted to stop it were too high. So in what it's the same pattern that repeats every time. At the same time, the group 1 and 2 that were doing this activity had to face the risk of what the group 3 would do in response. And they judged that the risks were worth it, so they proceeded. But there are risks, because the other group could get political power and punish the people who did it. So there were risks on both sides. So basically what happened was the administration just unilaterally granted a waiver to existing regulations or existing laws to allow something to happen that they wanted to happen. Okay, so that's my first example. My second example is, I was just reading a few days ago, and I'm not sure if you guys know about this, but this was from Racket News, and the title of the article is "The Trump Administration's Decision to End Most Enforcement of a Federal Law." So apparently in history, there was a gentleman named Randall Terry who was well known for blocking the entrances, and his group was well known for blocking the entrances to abortion clinics. And he'd formed blockades with himself and people who agreed with him. And as it's written in the article, it says, these sit-ins and blockades mostly came to an end in 1994 with the passage of the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, FACE for short. The legislation made it a federal crime to block entrances, and also made anyone who did so subject to federal lawsuits. President Trump's Justice Department, however, is no longer prosecuting FACE cases except under extraordinary circumstances. So here in real time, this is real time. This is not even going back into history of 4 years ago. This article is written about 4 or 5 days ago, and it's explaining how the Trump administration is group 1, and the people who want to blockade the abortion clinic is group 2, and there are existing regulations which prohibit that. So what the administration is going to do is tell those people that they're going to either explicitly tell them, or they're going to imply it, or they're going to communicate it to some way that they have a waiver or an exemption from the existing legislation, so that these people now are free to resume the activity that was prohibited or is prohibited by law, and now they're going to be free to engage in that, except in extraordinary circumstances, which I read to mean unless there's violence or something really, something extraordinary. So there's two examples that I think, in my opinion, are indisputable. In other words, the meaning of what happened is pretty indisputable, that there was an existing law or regulation. The people in power exempted the group from that and allowed the activity to proceed. So the pattern is there's a pre-existing restriction or regulation. One group communicates to another group that they will unilaterally not enforce the restriction. That is the waiver or the exemption. The third group observing this process is mad or angry, but the activity proceeds anyway. The fact that the activity proceeds indicates that it was impractical for the third group to stop the activity in question, meaning that the costs of stopping it were deemed to be too high. So they had to let the activity proceed. Though the third group did not want the waiver to be granted and did not want the activity to occur, the waiver was granted and the activity occurred nevertheless. So what do we have here? We have in the ideal functioning of the legal system, as you and I understand it, and all of our fellow citizens understand it, waivers and to restrictions are usually granted through the ordinary legal process, for example, through congressional legislation. So, for example, the fact that park rangers can drive in parks, and the fact that policemen can arrest people on the street, it's those waivers that allow them to do things that I can't do are in the legislation. That's the ideal way that we all think that it works. But the problem with that is, as we all know, that legislative process is very lengthy and very laborious. And if you embark on that, not only is it lengthy and laborious, but it also may not succeed. You could get outvoted, and you could get to 5 or 10 years down the path of trying to lift a restriction and still not get the restriction lifted. So when I think about immigration, I think, why didn't Congress get together? Why did they have to do what they just did the last 4 years? Why didn't they just get together, have a law, and say, we're going to let in 1 million people a year, and then set up a center in San Diego or in El Paso, Texas, or wherever the people are going to come across, set up some immigration centers and process immigrants? Well, it must have been, I don't know that answer, but I think the answer could have something to do with the fact that they may not actually be able to import as many people as they wanted to, or maybe not at all if they did it that way. So they just decided, it's not going to work if we do it through the normal channels, so we're going to do an alternative method. So this second method, the alternative method of granting restriction waivers, represents a parallel or alternative legal process in which one person or one group unilaterally grants restriction waivers to a second person or group, despite the strenuous objections of the third person or group. So that's the basic structure of what happens. This second method bypasses the standard legislative process. So now I'm going to head towards concluding this and showing how this parallels libertarianism in important ways, how what they're doing is actually libertarian in a certain way. So this second social process has essential commonalities with libertarian social theory. First, the legal atmosphere is one in which regulations prohibit voluntary agreements or voluntary arrangements between two parties. So in the cases we've been discussing, there's two parties or two people who want to do something, but the regulatory environment prevents them from voluntarily entering into that agreement. So whether society believes that thing should happen or not, the fact is that the two parties involved want to do this thing, but the regulations say, no, you can't do that thing. So that's what the law says. No, you two cannot do that. But they're in the positions of libertarians saying, but these regulations, we don't agree with the regulations. There's too many regulations. So that was my second point, is that as the seen from the point of view the two groups, they feel overregulated because there's something they badly want to do, and yet the regulations are very burdensome and onerous and suffocating and won't allow them to do it. So that's why they unilaterally suspend the regulation amongst themselves and bypass the burdensome legislative process. So my conclusion was this second social legal process has important commonalities with libertarianism. First, it is an implicit objection to and rejection of overregulation. That's because the things that they're doing are regulated, and the regulation prohibits the activity in question. So they're objecting, basically, in a sense, implicitly to the regulation. And second, this second method that they're utilizing is an instance of implementing voluntary agreements between two people or two groups, despite the regulations or despite the objection of a third party. So that's kind of the new part that I've added to what I had written, is that when I was originally thinking, well, libertarians could grant each other waivers from existing regulations, but that seems so taboo and so kind of outside of the norms. But when you look at and you see what's happening in the political atmosphere today, it's actually not that far out of the norms. It's actually being done, but we're just not, in a sense, seeing it clearly as a kind of a libertarian act to overcome existing regulations by just having two people say, well, we don't think we're ever going to get what we want legislatively, so we'll just agree to do this. And if the other people are mad, then they get mad, but we're going to do it anyway. So that's what's happening around us. So what prevents libertarians from employing the same method of restriction waiver in the same way? Well, obviously, libertarians do not hold political power. So me as a libertarian, since I don't control the police force, I can't grant a waiver in the same way, of course, that the administration can. But that doesn't mean that libertarians couldn't employ the same method in a way that doesn't require the enforcement agencies. So, in other words, if between two people, you don't the enforcement agencies don't come into play. So you can grant each other a waiver. For example, freedom of speech or minimum wage could be granted between two people. I don't have to have control of the police force if I'm dealing with somebody else who will allow me to do the activity with that other person. And then I conclude, as I did when we discussed this previously, if libertarians make an agreement between themselves, that agreement's voluntary, so that satisfies libertarian ethics. It's nonviolent and non-confrontational. I don't confront anybody in mainstream society. It's not based on geography. It's a borderless process. It does not require that anybody in society change their political ideology. I don't try to alter or abolish other people's political system. I don't have to try to get control of the political system that exists. And finally, this is a feasible and practical method because it's being employed now. There's two ways it could be implemented. One is by authorization, by getting exemptions in the legally authorized way. But there's also the unilateral way, which is being used as I just demonstrated, that the political parties are using. So this was the final conclusion was that this is one possible method by which libertarians could initiate their society and move libertarianism beyond the realm of scholarship and into the realm of practical politics.
Thank you, Adam. That's interesting. So you mentioned a discussion that we had earlier about the 3-person analysis that you have, and it really reminded me of a passage by Murray Rothbard in his book Power and Market, where he posits 3 different categories of what he calls interventions, following from, that's the word that Mises likes to use as well. And so interventions includes what you were talking about in terms of restrictions, regulations, and mandates. And so Rothbard I'll just read this passage. What types of intervention can the invader or an invader commit? Broadly, we may distinguish three categories. In the first place, the intervener may command an individual subject to do or not to do certain things, which, when these actions directly involve the individual's person or property alone. In short, he restricts the subject's use of his property when exchange is not involved. This may be called an autistic intervention. For any specific command directly involves only the subject himself. Secondly, the intervener may so for example, laws that are just like for their own good, like you're not allowed to consume a certain substance, or you're not allowed to read a certain book. Or, that's what he means by autistic intervention. Secondly, the intervener may enforce a coerced exchange between the individual subject and himself, or a coerced gift to himself from the subject. So, obvious example of that is taxation. That is just like, the government saying, you, one person, give me your money. And so that's not autistic, because it's not just saying, like, you can't do something with regard to yourself. It's like, okay, you have to give me something, or you have to. Yeah. Thirdly, the invader may either compel or prohibit an exchange between a pair of subjects. The former may be called binary intervention, since a hegemonic relation is established between two people, the intervener and the subject. The latter may be called a triangular intervention, since a hegemonic relation is created between the invader and a pair of exchangers or would-be exchangers. So the example of the tax would be a binary intervention. But the example that we've been talking about of the minimum wage law is a triangular intervention, because there's a pair of would-be exchangers, an employer and an employee, who want to do a certain rate, and you have a third person saying, no, like, you can't do that. It has to be above a certain wage level. And so you could call two people who want to do an exchange, A and B, and you could call the person the party that is intervening, you could call that G for government. And so with that in mind, I wonder if there is a disanalogy in your first example with what the kind of thing that you're talking about, because like with a minimum wage, it's very clear that it's that the government is preventing an exchange between two consenting adults. But with your immigration example, it seems that you are presenting the government as one of the parties, like wanting to do some kind of an exchange with an immigrant, and that it's people, non-governmental people who oppose immigration, who is wanting that to not be the case. And so, libertarians have diverging views on immigration. Like some are against any kinds of restrictions on immigration, and some favor those kinds of restrictions. So the libertarians who would say that, who are against restrictions, they would say, for example, that the two parties involved are immigrants, and, for example, an employer who would like to employ that immigrant. And it's the government who's getting involved by saying like, oh, well, you can't cross this imaginary line and have that free exchange. And another like aspect that seems like it's a disanalogy is that it seemed like with your analysis of how this kind of strategy would work in practice, that it is the cost of enforcement, the cost of intervening in a in the waiver granted between two libertarians, that that's because that's the risk, is that intervention. And but but the risk for the intervener is the cost involved, and so they might not intervene in that waiver, in that bilateral waiver, because of the cost involved. But it seems like in the incidents that you're talking about, like under the Biden administration, I don't really see, from what I understand, it wasn't that the Biden administration was like, oh, well, it's too costly. It seemed like it was a deliberate policy, like where they wanted to import like a lot of immigrants because they wanted to, have more Democratic voters. And so, and then, yeah, so why don't we start with that? Like, what do you think of those concerns?
Okay. Well, I think an easy way to visualize it is that the legal atmosphere, as I understand it, as we understand it, is, so think of it as what guides us. So when we walk out of our house in the morning or whatever, there's certain things we know we're not supposed to do, because we know there's some sort of penalty that could attach to doing some of those things. Whether or not they're true crime, the universally agreed upon crimes as assault and theft and such things such as that, but also just all the regulations which society has come up with based on social goals that they're trying to attain. So I think where the confusion is that what I'm saying is that if you think of the legal atmosphere as all of the prohibitions that are listed, that are in the legislation, we know what those are, so that guides our actions when we conduct our activity every day. So that's what prevents us from doing any number of things every day. So that's, if you're a law-abiding citizen, what it means is you know what the laws are, and then therefore you don't do what the law prohibits. So then, apparently, the way to be able to to gain the authority or the permission to take these activities, you have to change the law, right? Because that's the way the ideal legal system works, is that if I'm not allowed to do something, like, use whatever example we want, minimum wage, then okay, the way to change that is I petition my local government or my state government or my federal government to change the legislation, to change the cost benefit analysis of the penalties. And then when they lift that restriction through legislation, now I'm allowed to do that activity. So, but if I judge that that's not going to ever happen in my lifetime, let's say I say, well, that's not going to work because I'm never going to succeed in the legislative pathway. So assuming that I still want to be able to do the activity in question, how might I do that? Because we had discussed, even though we could say we try to educate people on the virtues of libertarianism, which essentially means they should allow us to go unmolested about our business and have the relationships we want to have, voluntary relationships, society says, no, we're not going to let you do that. So if we judge that that's not going to change, let's say in the next 30 or 40 years, then are there options for starting to gain the ability to do things on a voluntary basis other than getting the legislation changed? So therefore, the answer is yes. The answer is there are ways, but they seem a little risky. They seem like they're violating norms of social conduct, because you and I could make an agreement unilaterally between us on any number of issues. Whether it could be free speech, it could be minimum wage, it could be, there's many things that we could between us that are prohibited in the legislation, that we could unilaterally say, well, it's not prohibited between us, and we could do that. But then the reason we choose not to is because it's a little bit risky, because there's a third group that would be hostile. So what I was trying to show, or what I'm trying to show, is that this is not just a problem that libertarians face, but that using the examples that I outlined, which was the example of immigration and the example of the abortion clinics, that the regulations are as written do prohibit the activity that is being proposed or being done, and the parties involved have judged that legislation will not allow them to do it in the foreseeable future. Because if it did, if let's say the Biden administration could have gotten the legislation passed within 1 year, why wouldn't they just pass those laws, get it approved? Biden was president, etc. Get it approved, and just do it legally. Just set up the immigration centers in the southwestern United States and start processing immigrants. Why wouldn't they do that? I'm assuming, or what I'm saying assumes, that they realized that they weren't going to be able to attain the immigration levels they wanted legislatively. So what did they do? They did what I was suggesting that might be a path for libertarians, which is they said one group granted an exemption to the other group after judging that the risks posed by the third group were not insurmountable. They judged that, well, these people are not going to like this if we do this, but what can they do about it? There's nothing. They're not going to show up with arms on the border, and they were correct that nobody did show up with arms on the border by and large. So they made a correct assessment. Go ahead.
So earlier you were like, at first you were talking about like one way of getting a waiver is to have the government grant the waiver to people.
Yeah, let's say let's call it legislatively. So in other words, one way to get a waiver, the same way the policeman can arrest people and the park ranger can, it's in the legislation. It says, you are allowed to, if it's not in the legislation, then you and I should go stop and say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. And he'd say, yeah, you're right. And I'd call the police on him, right? And say, why is this guy driving in the public park? I mean, he's ruining the wildlife in there. He's driving a combustion engine vehicle in the national park. Why is he allowed to do that? But their answer is going to be he's authorized to do that. And the authorization comes from legislation.
But that's not the only way that a government can grant a waiver. Like, the government can also grant the waiver just by not enforcing the law. But in that case, it's still the government granting the waiver. It's not, and that's still the problematic way that you posited first, that you said was highly unlikely, and it's not sort of like the more realistic way that you posited later of two libertarians granting each other waivers. So that's why I think the examples that you posit like aren't examples of what of the strategy that you're positing, because in both cases, like in one case it's it's Biden, the Biden administration, the government granting a waiver, like basically granting permission to immigrants simply by not enforcing the law, the immigration laws. And in the other case, it's also Trump like granting permission to the abortion protesters by not enforcing the law. So it's two different things. It's like legislation versus just changing the laws versus just not enforcing it. But in both cases, it's still the government doing that for its own purposes. And it's not because it, it's not because the you know, two libertarians or are granting waivers to each other, but because that does happen in both of those cases. Um like when immigrants, when immigrants just defy the immigration laws, it, especially in mass numbers, it becomes really costly to crack down on them. It really becomes really costly to enforce those laws. And so in those cases, like especially when you think of it in terms of, immigrants and their employers as implicitly granting each other waivers from immigration laws, and then the government, like because of the cost of cracking down on that they just let it happen for the most part, that seems to be consistent with the strategy that you're positing, but not what actually happened, which is Biden actually like wanting the immigration to happen for political purposes. And in the same way with the abortion clinic thing, like it conceivably could be that like just so many abortion protesters were committing civil disobedience by blocking these passages, and so then the government just, it was just too costly, especially in terms of public relations, because it would just look really bad to see them carting off these peaceful people who were just sitting there. Like, you can argue whether or not that's actually peaceful, but in the same way that the civil disobedience of like the civil rights movement and like Gandhi's movement in India, and like both influenced by Thoreau's doctrines of civil disobedience, where it just becomes very um costly in terms of the government's credibility, like not even costly in terms of like outlay of expenditures, but just got costly in terms of just like the moral authority of the government. It's just like looks really bad for them to do those kinds of things. That could happen, but it seems like in this case, like it's actually just Trump, just wanting wanting to let that happen because it's what a lot of his Christian supporters like want. And so it seems like it's like a political bone to throw to them. So like, yes, does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't see an inconsistency. If you or someone wants to argue, listen, Adam, Biden didn't want to allow them immigration to occur. It just happened against his wishes. Somebody could make that fact. It's a kind of a factual argument. I would take the other side of that argument, say no. As I view things, he wanted to allow it, and the law doesn't allow it. In other words, we have borders, and my argument assumes that there is actual legislation which makes crossing our border illegal. And then any legislation is not legislation. It's only a suggestion if it doesn't have a penalty. So, I distinguish between legislation and suggestions. So if something's in legislation, I think a legislation is meaningless unless it has a penalty attached. So theoretically, or in practice, this should be any it was illegal for those people to enter. And then as our legal system works, then the government impartially enforces those laws, because that's what's been vetted legislatively through the democratic process. That's the ideal legal system. So what, if we were naively believed that that was what was going on, then what should have happened is anybody who came across the border should have been apprehended, and they should have said, well, where's your documentation? You're not allowed to be here, and back you go. But that's not what happened. So my interpretation of why that didn't happen was that that the Biden administration viewed the legislation, the regulatory environment, as too burdensome to obtain what their goals were, which was more immigration. So they unilaterally granted a waiver to the immigrants to come across. And I'm just saying that, I'm not saying it as a complaint in my argument. I'm saying it's just a fact, as a method that they devised in a regulatory environment which they thought was oppressive. In other words, we think it's right that these people come across. And then they look at the legislation. It says you can't do that. And they said, well, this is over-regulation. This is burdensome and we're being overly regulated. So what's the solution? They would think to themselves. And the answer was, well, we control the enforcement mechanism, regardless of what the law says. We just want to enforce it. So I think that's what you're saying. And I see Trump doing the same thing. And I'm not worried about the reasons they're doing. In other words, that we know what the reasons are, is different constituencies, let's say, that they're trying to please, which, again, that's just a fact. It's not a complaint. Politicians have constituencies, and they act to benefit those constituencies. So in Trump's case, he has a constituency that will be happy that he's not going to enforce this legislation, which is called the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. So the pattern, though, is that there's the one person who wants to do something. Somebody wants to come across the border, or somebody wants to block the entrance to an abortion clinic. The law says it's prohibited. And then the people who control the enforcement say, well, we're going to grant you a waiver and let you do what you want to do. And then there's a third group who's very unhappy about that. So that the third group, from the point of view of the two people who are doing this thing, who are circumventing the legislation, there is a slight risk that what is this third group going to do? Because they could, with the abortion clinic, leftist activists could show up at those abortion clinics and violently confront the blockaders. There's a risk. And the risk with what Biden did was that Americans could have gotten their cars and trucks and driven down to the border, and there could have, there was a risk involved. But it ended up that the calculation that the Biden administration made, in a limited sense, was a correct calculation, that we will do this, they will get mad, but we will get what we want. And that's what ended up happening. They actually did get the immigration they wanted. It was not prevented by the third group. The third group said to themselves, I assume, this is too risky. If I go down there myself and try to stop this, it's not going to be good for me. I could get hurt, could end up in jail, not going to go down there. So the American citizens didn't go down there. And then the same thing here with what Trump is doing. If I had to guess, I think more leftists will come and confront but the problem is, if the leftists come down there and the administration is behind the blockaders, then the leftist protesters are going to have some very big risk calculation to make, because if there's federal agents there protecting the blockaders, somebody could get hurt. So I'm just trying to show that for a person or a group who's in the position where the legislation prohibits something, that and the prospects of changing the legislation are not good in the near term. And when I say near term, I mean 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That, well, what can that person or group do? And so I thought, well, with libertarians, they don't control the law enforcement. So they would have to kind of start small. They'd have to start just between little things between themselves that don't involve, that doesn't require the lifting of enforcement. They could just start on a small scale. the big boys on the national scale get to start on a large scale because they can do big things because they control the enforcement authorities. They control the police department and the National Guard and the border control patrol agents. So since they have that, they operate on a much larger scale. So they can do much bigger things. They can give way bigger waivers than little individual people. But in principle, if that's what's going on, if we're all of us in an overburdened, overregulated environment, if Biden is in an overregulated environment because the law says he can't import the people he wants to import, and if Trump's in an overregulated environment because the legislation says he's not, that his constituents aren't allowed to block abortion clinics, and if I'm in an overregulated environment that says I can't agree with somebody that I hire on the wage, what's the difference between the three of us? And we're all saying that we're overregulated with regard to what we want to do. And then I can show you how that's being circumvented. So my point is only that there's other ways for people to proceed other than just getting legal authority through the legislative process. And I'm not, apparently I didn't invent that process because I'm pretty sure that Biden and Trump, don't know who I am. They didn't read anything I said. So they've already stumbled upon this way of in a sense, a libertarian social act of rebellion against overregulation is what they're doing. So, I mean, libertarians are kind of the owners of the gripe against overregulation. I mean, burdensome regulation, overregulation, suffocating regulation. That was the libertarians' calling card, that's, I thought, our wheelhouse. And yet, it's funny that when the subject of overregulation comes up, the ones who are kind of leading the way in getting around it are the people who were the instigators of the regulation. And they're basically showing how you can, another way to avoid the regulation that's an alternative to the legislative process.
Right, which is basically just to ignore the legislation, right? That for the
well, on those single issues, I mean, they're not, in fairness to them, I think they're still abiding by most of the regulations. In other words, they're not them and their constituents aren't polluting rivers, and they're not, doing a whole bunch of illegal things. They're just picking certain things that are important to them, and then saying, listen, we're not going to be constrained by, we're going to unilaterally grant this group a waiver and an exemption so that they can proceed. So I understand.
Yeah, and it's libertarian if it's ignoring anti-liberty laws, but it's a double-edged sword because, for example, there's a lot of ignoring of laws going on in California, but it was ignoring laws that were for the protection of private property, like it basically legalizing shoplifting in California. So it's a double-edged sword because when you can give the government the discretion of just ignoring whatever laws that they want, that can go in a libertarian direction, but it can go in a very non-libertarian direction too.
A great example, because I know that what I'm talking about, there's many, many examples, and I'm glad you brought this one up. So to me, what happened in California was that clearly one of the Democrat Party's priorities is lowering the incarceration rate for disadvantaged groups. But the legislation says, basically, if you steal, there's legislation prevents theft. So the authorities in California, in order to achieve their goal of lowering the incarceration rate, gave a waiver or an exemption to disadvantaged groups to engage in criminal activity. Then there's the third group who's mad about that. And, whoever objected to that was mad. But the activity did proceed. In other words, the two groups, the group who got granted the waiver and the group who wanted to commit the activity, to engage in the activity, did do it. They were allowed to do it. So whoever made the political judgment, the risk judgment, judged in that short time frame, judged correctly that although the third party who was against this arrangement would be mad, that they would be able to attain their goal, which was to not be incarcerating disadvantaged groups. So it was a method for circumventing a regulatory environment. The regulatory environment clearly says that theft has a list of punishments. The government is clearly supposed to be apprehending criminals, and they know that. And I'm not saying something like that. They know that. They're doing this on purpose because they're saying, well, listen, this is the regulation is, if we go to try to change this law to try to grant the exemption legally or through the legislative process, we're not going to succeed. They've made that judgment.
Well, that's not what
I
you normally
empathize with that.
call. That's not what you normally call a regulatory environment. Like, I mean, that's what libertarianism is recognizing the right to life, liberty, and property. And so, like, securing people's property is not like over regulation. Like, that's the one thing that governments are supposed to be doing.
Well, as the third person in that equation, I'm not claiming there was overregulation. It's overregulation from the point of view of the people who wanted to do the activity, because it's not morally. It's just by logic. In other words, the regulation clearly prevents it. So, from their point of view, something that they want to do is legislatively regulated against. That's just a fact. So the regulations clearly say that in our conduct out there in the world, we're not allowed to steal stuff. And if we do, there's the penalties. It's the first one, you go to jail, you go to bail, you get so their predicament was, in that regulatory environment, that legislative legal environment, what they wanted to do was actually prohibited. They judged that the prospects for obtaining legal permission or authorization were not good in the time frame in which they wanted to conduct the activity. So then they had to think to themselves, well, what else can we do? And so they said, or thought to themselves, well, we control the enforcement mechanism. We don't have to enforce the law. We can grant a waiver implicitly. I'm sure there's no piece of paper that says you have a waiver on it in any of these instances we're talking about. It was an implicit agreement between the people who wanted to do a certain activity and the people who had the power to grant a waiver for that. And so they granted.
By the same token, you could say that, like, someone who doesn't want to be robbed wants to be able to keep their property, and like the robber is regulating that, so to speak, that they don't have they're not doing it under the color of the law, but they are, so to speak, taxing these people of their property. So like you're just you're getting rid of, if that's how you're going to define regulation, you're just you're just getting rid of a regulation of a regulator. So it's like if you're calling all of that regulation, then you're just you've still got regulation. So like I
Yeah,
think
but
I think
again,
that defined, yeah.
um, in any of these examples, I'm on one side or the other. In other words, I'm not immune for any social process that occurs. In other words, I'm totally susceptible to all the social processes that people go through. So, for example, in the example from California, I'm definitely in the camp of people who would be objecting. So the people who are going to do this are saying, well, what are the chances that Adam does something about this? Is he going to come after the legislators? Am I going to show up at their house? Is he going to show up in the store and create a problem? Is he going to, bear arms and go down to the stores and stop this? There's risks they have to consider. And what I'm saying is they judged correctly. I did not do that. So in other words, they were able to proceed with the act. They had judged it correctly. But just one quick note is that I understand that like a criminal can come to somebody's house and there's certain structural things that'll happen. But in what I'm trying to talk about, it's strictly limited to libertarianism, which is the relationship between an individual and government. So that basically entails the legislation and the enforcement of laws which prevent me as a libertarian from doing nonviolent things that I would like to do. So it doesn't include, let's say, if I act badly towards somebody in my personal life, that's excluded from what I'm talking about unless the government gets involved or has something to say about that. So what I'm discussing is ideas about you have a legal environment, you have an established government, and then you have people who want to do things which are prohibited. Because libertarians are basically the poster child for wanting to do things that are prohibited. I thought our whole existence, the French word raison d'être, or whatever, however they say it, is that we want to do things voluntarily that society says, no, you're not doing that. We're not going to let you do that because we have a different view of things. And so we're not allowed to establish voluntary relationships. Again, using the example of a minimum wage as an example. Regardless of all the great arguments that society might have about not allowing me to make a voluntary agreement, they may have great arguments. The fact is I'm not allowed to do it. And it's something I would enter into voluntarily and non-violently with another person. So if I want to do that, and my prospects for obtaining that legislatively are, very low. So in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, I'm not going to get the right to make voluntary agreements with my fellow libertarians. So the question is, well, is there any other way for me to begin and establish a libertarian society? So my answer was, well, there is a way, but it's kind of risky. I could just go to another libertarian and say, well, why don't we come up with some easy beginning steps to lift restrictions between us, and we'll just do it between us, not underground, not hidden, just plain sight of everybody, plain sight of our neighbors and the government and Republicans, Democrats, and we just do it in plain sight. And that entails some risks, but that's just the same. That's the formula, because in the 3-person equation, if I agree with somebody to do something, I grant them the restriction, then the third party is the government or the Democrats or the Republicans, and they might be hostile and they may decide to come after me. So I have to take that into consideration before I do anything. Just as Biden and Trump have to look and judge and say, well, listen, if we do this, if we let X million people come across the border and just stream across, some people are going to get really, really mad about this. So what will they do? Well, I mean, they have to look at that, because things could get really bad. If there was an arm, if people went down to the border with arms, that'd be a pretty serious situation.
But isn't the problem you're trying to solve how libertarian civilians can achieve liberty, not how government officers like Trump and Biden can achieve liberty?
Yes, but what I'm saying is Biden and Trump are showing us a way. They're showing us that the method that I was discussing in my essay is already being utilized. In a sense, they're normalizing it, because unintentionally normalizing or validating a method of social interaction in the context of government that I was am advocating in my essay that libertarians could also do, but on an individual scale, not on the scale of government, but on an individual scale. And they're demonstrating that, in a sense, they agree with me because the legislation clearly prohibits the exemptions that they're granting, and yet they unilaterally granted those exemptions. So it would be no different for a libertarian to say, well, Adam, doesn't legislation prohibit you from hiring Dan for $10 an hour? And I would say, in some state, let's say, and I'd say yes, yes, it does. So what are you doing? Well, Dan and I agreed amongst each other that we're not going to enforce that restriction or that regulation, and we're going to work for each other for $10 an hour. And then somebody might say, well, yeah, but I see what you're saying there and I see what you're doing there, but there could be risks to that. I mean, aren't you going to get in trouble, or, what might happen? Yes. So therefore, um, I have to judge those risks before I want to, but that's no different than what Trump and Biden had to do. They had to judge the costs and the risks from what they did. It was the same, but it's the same form. It's the same exact structure.
Well, it's not exactly the same. I mean, it both involves flouting laws that are on the books, but in the case of government officers, it's it's just different from the case of civilians trying to win freedom for themselves. And I just think that there are a lot better examples that abound, that happen every day, because people do already do that, and I think it does achieve liberty, like that that's like the main, I think it's the main strategy. There's a group of libertarians from like the 1980s, maybe going back to the 70s. They're called voluntarists. Nowadays, the term voluntarist, it kind of is interpreted as broader, but at the time it was like this very specific group of libertarians. I think George Smith was one, and Wendy McElroy, and they really strenuously opposed voting, e- or any kind of like trying to achieve liberty like through the political process, by through like getting involved with the state. And one of the techniques that, or strategies that they really favored, was simply just disobeying unjust laws, and and just, with the understanding that the more that spreads, the more that like it becomes costly for the government to enforce laws that people on a mass scale are just flouting, or and also that, you know the more that governments don't enforce s- laws, for that reason, because of the costs, that like those laws just become dead letters. And um and so like and people who aren't even libertarians, and who've never heard of voluntarism, like they do that all the time, and and a large part of our freedom, I think, is because of that. Like our freedom to drive, our freedom to drive, like to take like a very subtle, or a very minor example, the freedom to drive 70 miles an hour in a 65-mile-per-hour zone.
Hmm.
I mean, that's just because just people do it, and people do it so much that it would be, cost prohibitive for highway patrol officers to enforce that. And but then, like, more more significant examples have been sort of like piracy, like online piracy. Just like there's just so many people just doing it, and it was just so difficult to enforce that it was, at least for a while, like it was kind of like something that people were able to do. And so yeah, so I think that like, and a lot of these are like flouting autistic, what Rothbard calls autistic interventions, and flouting binary interventions. So when people just don't report a certain amount of income to the IRS, like a lot of people do that. I don't, for the record, in case anyone's spying. But that is basically like flouting what Rothbard called a binary intervention. And because people have do it on such a mass scale, and because it's so hard for the IRS to like do anything about that, like, except for like when it's like really large amounts, or when it's like really easy, it's easy to catch in an audit or something like that. Then that's flouting a binary intervention. But with flouting binary interventions, like it doesn't really work to achieve that liberty through agreements between libertarians, like between waivers, because it's binary. It's just a matter of like the government and one person. Like it's not like a triangular intervention like the minimum wage, where there can be like agreements between the two consenting parties. Same thing for autistic interventions, that if someone just consumes some substance in the privacy of his or her home against the law, then they're flouting that law. And to the extent that they do that, then the law does become a dead letter. But again, there's nobody to make to grant a waiver to. There's nobody to make an agreement to. So it seems that like, in terms of creating a nascent society through these kinds of waivers, like for like a big portion of interventions, like all autistic and binary interventions, like it doesn't really apply. Although it does apply to, it could conceivably apply to triangular interventions. So yeah, so I think that like I said, a lot of people who aren't doing it for based on like libertarian theory, they're just they don't have some sort of like principled objection to these kinds of things. They just largely just don't want to have to obey these laws themselves. And yet it still achieves a lot of liberty. But what if libertarianism spread so much as an ideology, and people just started in much more deliberately than they're doing now, and in much greater numbers than they're doing now, um in a sense granting waivers to each other with triangular interventions, by disobeying unjust laws, and by just disobeying unjust laws in general, such that it becomes like really cost prohibitive for the government to enforce these laws. you know that does seem like a very promising path to freedom.
Mhm.
And so that's like another reason why I think that libertarian education is so important, because that's how that ideology would spread.
Well, first, I agree with you that if our government tries to enforce society-wide certain things that everyone in society disagrees with, such as if they set speed limits that are too low as viewed by most people, which is kind of what they do. So if you ever drive the speed limit consistently, you realize how slow it is. And, they say, well, go around this turn 45 miles an hour. And if you actually slow down to 45 miles an hour, you realize it's going to take me all day to get around that turn. So this, in a sense, that's society broadly agrees that they don't agree. So they all decide not to do it, let's say. Another example, I guess, would be prohibition, where the government says, well, we don't want you guys drinking any alcohol anymore. And society goes, wow, that's just not going to work for me because, I like my glass of wine or I like my beer. And so I see those. They do have some commonalities, but I guess in my thinking, there are some unspoken goals or some unspoken parts of it that I probably need to explain better through time. Um, the way I kind of judge libertarian actions, such as the one you were describing with the voluntarists, or anybody who's kind of sporadically, in my opinion, sporadically or randomly, in a sense, deciding to disobey, let's say, laws or whatever, is I judge the libertarian movement by whether society at large is becoming more restrictive or whether it's becoming more uh, liberal in the old sense of liberalization from restrictions. And I would argue that it's undeniable that we are becoming more restricted and more regulated each year and each decade. And so, to me, any philosophy or action plan that has been tried until now has not succeeded. So my writing is still in the realm of theory; it's not in the realm of action yet. So when I'm looking at this, I'm judging it by the results, that there would have to be some sort of noticeable change in society on the ground. When we talked before, I used the example of Bitcoin, that once it was released and once it was adopted by a number of people, and it didn't take very long before everybody who's involved in finance has to take account of Bitcoin. So there's no question that it's made a profound impact in world finance. So I'm judging things by that standard, that the proposed plan is ambitious in that it would non-violently, through voluntary participation, introduce a new phenomenon that would have that kind of impact. And I think where we see things differently is that you're saying that through education, we could change the ideology of potentially change the ideology of the society at large to a degree enough that we could, because it'd be hard to think that you just change everybody, that everybody 100% would become libertarian. But to the degree, what would be the standard? We want it to be changed to a degree enough where we start to be able to do things now which are prohibited, basically. So, but the examples, and I've mentioned it several times in our discussion, that I'm showing, the people involved judged that the prospects for changing legislatively, but also ideologically. In other words, I mean, if Biden thought that he could change everybody's opinion on immigration quickly enough so that the votes would manifest, so that the legislation would manifest, so that he can import immigrants to the extent he wanted to, I think he may have considered that path. But I think he judged, and the people on his side judged, that the prospects for changing that ideology in their lifetime was too short. That wouldn't happen in their lifetime or in the time that they wanted to take the action. And the same thing for all these examples is that the people involved have made a judgment that yes, it's possible that things could change down the line in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, such that what I want could actually be granted more easily. In other words, I wouldn't have to do anything. I could just keep being who I am. Society would change. Then I'd be able to do what I want without doing any kind of risky activity. So I'd be kind of protected because society would want me to do what I want to do. But what I have made a judgment that looking at society, that I don't see the prospects for society to say, well, we want libertarians now. We want libertarianism. We no longer believe in in regulating things on a continual basis with mounting regulations, and we now believe in repealing, repealing laws, repealing regulations. We now believe in that. So we're gonna reverse course, and from now on, things are going to get more and more free. I mean, I would like to hear that. I'd like to see that. But what I'm writing about, or what my theory addresses, what would someone do if that in the event that doesn't happen, or in the event that you judge that will not happen. So I don't if the libertarian scholarship that exists for the last 50 or 70 years can convince people to change their political views such that I am now a more free person next week and the following month and the following year, then I don't know. Then I think I'd lose my complaints. I mean, I don't know what I'd be, what my complaint would be. But I realistically, I don't know if that's realistic. And then the question, does somebody okay with, okay, well, that's just not my time then. I'm a non-libertarian time in history, and where we're going, there's more and more regulations. And I've coined the term. I don't know if I've ever heard of the term, but democratic communism or communist democracy. I mean, we're kind of heading there. And so, is there anything that the individual can do, um, action wise? Not but sticking with the non-libertarian um, ethics of nonviolence and voluntary agreements and discussion and kindness towards other people and tolerance. Is there anything that can be done? So I'm trying to address that, but I know we will have many opportunities to discuss the nuances of that.
Indeed.
Well, I think we kind of covered it, pro and con, and thanks for your participation, Dan. Thanks for giving a perspective on it, and for listening to my ideas.
Yeah. Thank you for elaborating on it and for zooming in on one part of your system. So appreciate it.
Thank you.